You're about to hear my conversation with Benoit Gervais, head of Mackenzie's Resources Boutique. Today, we'll place U.S. actions in Venezuela and ambitions for Greenland in the context of resources and geopolitics. We'll also discuss what the New World Order means for Canada, and we'll have a closer look at gold and discuss industrial uses for silver, one of which might even make some light bulbs go off. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Listeners should seek professional advice for their situation. Welcome to The Invested, a podcast from Mackenzie Investments. My name is Rajan Bansi, head of portfolio construction. Today, I'm joined by Benoit Gervais, head of Mackenzie Investments Resources Boutique. Benoit, thank you for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Benoit, I'm going to get right into my questions. I'm speaking with you during the events in Davos, Switzerland, and we're still hearing lots of chatter of President Trump and his ambitions for annexing Greenland. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts right now, the current environment at the intersection of geopolitics and resources, given we're barely weeks removed from the U.S. actions in Venezuela as well?
Well, we're definitely living in a multipolar world. Things have changed since his very first term, followed up by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we keep compounding on some of those events by adding more here. And we're at a critical time for sure in Davos. But I think the U.S. is playing for control of the Western Hemisphere. It may seem like their actions in Venezuela is to control oil. And I think that's a nice small ad, but really it's about making sure that China's influence in Venezuela is pushed out. People forget we had this incident in the Panama Canal, right, where an attempt for BlackRock to buy out the Chinese that own the ports on either side of the Panama Canal. And in Denmark, it may seem like we are after critical minerals. There aren't that many critical minerals in Denmark. The most important ownership that they have is what is quite contentious, the property of the Northern Passage to the north of Canada or to the north of Russia, they may say. So Russia made an application in 2014 to extend the continental shelf to the UN, and that's being considered. Later on, Denmark did the same. And at the moment, as we know, as the world is warming up, this Northern Passage is becoming more and more valuable. If you want to control energy flows, whether it's to the south of the U.S. or to the north of the U.S. and have geopolitical considerations and tensions, then all of those elements are very critical, at least in the eyes of the U.S. administration.
Fascinating, Benoit. I love that. What a great way to start our conversation. I love how you talk about the flow of resources. I'm just curious. We are in a world with two major superpowers, the United States and China. From your seat, how are these two superpowers approaching their energy resource sovereignty?
So people think of energy as mostly fossil fuel. And most of our existence, we have been dependent and continue to be dependent on fossil fuel. There is some migration from what I would say perhaps more dirty fuels like coal going to oil. And then I think we are migrating as a world to gas as a new source of energy. But the real high growth is happening in electricity. And only about a quarter of the total energy consumed by the world population is actually electricity. But that's growing mid-single digits versus the overall energy consumption growing at 1-ish%. And that distinction is important because fossil fuel have been dispersed by Mother Nature unevenly, created some tensions and the need to control other countries or at least energy flows. And China was quite wise in identifying this. It was a large importer of oil, continues to be a large importer of oil, but it decided to shift its society towards electricity consumption by being a leader in EV or electric vehicles, solar panels, and other renewable energy sources. So they control the whole chain in trying to build energy sovereignty. right? And I think Europe is finding itself in that same corner where it was over dependent on Russian gas, diversified away with some US and Qatar gas, but it remains dependent. And that's probably a nice solution in the interim. But over the long term, everybody should be thinking about building energy sovereignty, especially in this multipolar world. Depending on China for renewable, also, because they own most of those technologies, or the EVs for that matter, is probably not a good long term solution.
Follow-up question for you. That's so interesting. You referred to Europe having just learned the painful lesson of being too dependent on Russian gas. But it sounds like in China, they've been thinking about energy sovereignty or independence for at least the last couple of decades. Do I perhaps have that right? They've been thinking about the supply chain in Europe and the United States. Maybe we're thinking we're still in an integrated global economy or global order, and now they're kind of catching up to the reality. Is that fair to say?
Very much so. I think that they were slow moving for the past couple of decades, thinking about energy independence. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine just accelerated all of those considerations. Trump is accelerating it for the rest of the world.
So we're in Canada. President Trump is just next door. Canada does have a lot of natural resources. The president's provocative comments about Canada, maybe about a year ago, perhaps are starting to make a lot more sense. But this new world order, what does all of this really mean for Canada? And take your time to work through not just President Trump, but also what Prime Minister Carney is thinking right now with the Major Projects Office.
What's very clear is that we are not leaders when it comes to producing cars. And competing with the US, or even worse, with China producing electric vehicles several generations ahead of us, is going to be very difficult. We have to play up our competitive advantage. We are really well endowed in Canada. We have lots of land, lots of energy, lots of actually green energy, but also we have fossil fuel, and countries like China and the US are dependent on us. So I think in the interim, as I said, we're going to be using those fossil fuels for some time still. And that allows us to bridge us into the future where we really want to go, where those critical minerals are going to allow many countries, including China and the US and Europe, to build their energy independence, because pretty much all of the minerals that are produced go in some way, small or big, into those renewable technologies, particular solar and wind and nuclear. Okay. So now we're not producing enough. Copper probably needs production needs to double over the next 20 years if we want to keep up with the current trajectory of, of renewables. So we have a lot, but we've been underproducing them. From Mr. Carney, and I see this here at this very juncture as an opportunity to attract capital, wherever that's coming from. They will need some of those minerals. We have to make it inviting. It has not been inviting in Canada because permitting process is taking 10 years. Very few investors have this type of investment horizon. In contrast, in Australia, it's 6 to 18 months. They have the same considerations, the environment, indigenous consideration, not in my backyard consideration. Yet it's taking them 1/10 the time that it's taking us, call it a year versus 10 years. It's also probably pushes those investment opportunity outside maybe of this renewable big growth that we have in front of us right here, right now. So I think the government has rightfully adopted a few tools here for the execution over the next 0 to 2 years. And then that's the Major Projects Office, F-13 projects. That's great. They were already underway. We just want to make sure that they're executed and they're successful. But now let's talk about year 3 to 15. And that's where we at McKinsey, and invite you to go on our peruse our website and look at our white paper. We've identified 7 clusters, what I would call low hanging fruits for the Carney's administration to focus on, because over there they either need streamlined permitting, several projects in one clusters, right, could benefit from one streamlined set of permits, infrastructure, that can be shared, right? So the last mile when it comes to transmission line or road or railway, I'm thinking of the Yukon here that could benefit from one pipeline. Those are examples that if you bring focus, you can unlock not just one investment, but several investments in the billions. Great for Canadians, great for jobs. We can relocate some of the construction workers, which I think in places like Toronto, there's going to be lots of freed up construction workers to go in and apply their skills and trades over there on some of those mines. So I think the juncture is just fantastic for Canada. Now let's see if we can make this inviting.
Very good. So the time is right. It sounds like you're encouraged by some of the signs from the federal government, but there's more to do. What does Canada need to do to fully take advantage of the moment?
It would be easy to say, let's sponsor one or two or three projects and match perhaps government money with private money. That would be one of the ideas that is currently floated around. I don't think there's going to be enough capital of that type, and it's probably going to be unmanageable. What we need to create is an environment where it is predictable. I execute on an environmental study and a consultation process that is reasonable, fair, and streamlined. And at the end of it, if I can match all of the requirements as a company, I'm expected to get a permit. And that has not been the case. In many instances, what happened is that the rules were revised along the way. And that's how it became not a 1 year exercise, but a 5, 10 year problem for many companies where you say, well, I may get the permit or may not get the permit, in which case that's not very inviting. Right. So at the intersection of this permit, so many questions, right? Is indigenous questions, environmental questions, emission, infrastructure questions. Those are all answers and help that we can get from the government. That's their role, is to create a context that is predictable, reasonable, repeatable, so that the private capital market can say, wow, this is a place that we can match mineral endowment with a reasonable outcome when it comes to return.
Very good. Thank you so much, Benoit. I'm going to shift gears slightly, but it's actually building on something that you said in your answer, and you pointed our listeners to the website and to check out your thought leadership. I'm going to double down on that suggestion because your team does publish some fabulous thought leadership, and some of that thought leadership has been on the subject of electrification. When we talk about resources, I think mining or with respect to energy generation gets all of the attention or a lot of the attention, but the reality is you actually have to move the stuff, all right? You have to move the electrons. So talk to us about the theme of electricity and electrification and how that builds in to the resources complex because I think it's really important.
I think this movement towards electrification is well underway. It's probably more front page today because artificial intelligence, and it's a bit of a race to the moon, where artificial intelligence, every country wants to win. That's one place where we're not going to offshore to a cheaper place. We want to have control over data and win that race, and that's boosted electricity consumption even further. So the US, which has been running 0% consumption growth of electricity for 20 years, for the past 5 years, been running 4 or 5%. That's a big jump. And some people probably think of this as a simple exercise of producing more electrons, but there's a whole chain behind this, right? You have to transmit those electrons from where they are produced to the centers of consumption. So in China, in this case, is northwest going to the southeast. That they've built those massive high voltage lines, and it basically crossing from one corner of the country to the other. So we have to do some of this. The implications of managing the load, which is intermittent. People don't charge their EVs at predictable time. You have to have slack in your capacity. You have to think of a world where you're going to be generating power from all kinds of sources. That's also variable. So you think of solar, wind, some of the base load. You want to match those variable sources with perhaps on demand sources like natural gas, right? And there, when we're talking about turbines, well, there's a 3 year to 5 year lineup of people wanting to buy natural gas turbine because in the Western world, unlike China, We haven't been growing that fast. Like I said, it's only been a 5-year trend. So the likes of Siemens Energy and Schneider have been accustomed to a 0 to 3% type of growth in those markets. Now we're pushing their growth rate to 10%. So we're in the economy of building infrastructure, building generation, building transmission lines, building renewables versus the economy of knowledge. So it's a big contrast. We haven't done a lot of building. In fact, our infrastructure are 20 years behind. And we know that because the focus for society was on the economy of knowledge. That is really the problem. So we have a lack of capacity when it comes to building infrastructure.
An amazing, amazing perspective. Thank you so much, Benoit. And certainly not one that I think is top of mind for most Canadians, but certainly as you lay out pretty effectively for us to take full advantage of this moment, that is also part of the transition we all need to make. Now, I'm just looking at the time. I only have time for one more question. And what would a question be with our resources lead without asking about gold and silver? I'd love to get your thoughts broadly about gold and silver as well. And if I could ask a favor, when you talk about silver, please share the insights and the most prominent use of silver that you shared with me in a recent conversation that I think might be news for most of our listeners.
I'll start with gold and precious metals as a whole and end with that question on silver. I think gold is really a barometer of what's happening in the world. And the world is breaking down as in fractions. It's multipolar. And it talks about one big currency, the US dollar, which has been really the currency of trade and has been the reserve currency for many. People are asking themselves, well, do I really want to own fixed income, US fixed income going forward? I probably own a lot of equity. They've done tremendously well. The S&P 500 has been fantastic. So has been the MSCI world for the last several years. I probably don't want to buy more of those. Yet there is so much money in the system. And in fact, Trump and the deregulations of banks have made it even easier to lend money and for the capital ratios to be boosted for the banks. So there's more lending coming from the big banks. So where do I put my fixed income if I don't want to buy US fixed income? I have lots of money. I have my S&P 500, and that's where gold and precious metals is playing an important diversification game. And we've been saying here at Mackenzie 5 to 10% for years. And maybe the impetus to do so wasn't there, but now it's becoming more and more obvious in this multipolar world. And silver is intriguing, but why? Because it tends to be the lagging precious metal version of gold. So that means we call it the poor man's gold. It tends to catch up later in the game when gold tends to do well. But it has this other half, which has been largely industrial based. Historically, as people remember, we used it to make photo films, right? And Kodak was a big consumer of silver. That went away. Today, the use is not photography, but it's in solar panels. And China has never built as many solar panels as it did last year. And that trend is set to accelerate, not just in China, but as I was saying, as people build, or countries are building energy sovereignty, solar panels are really an enabler. So there will be more silver consumption, industrially speaking, and it's also serving a purpose when it comes to moving away from what I would call fiat currency and the problem that we have with having too much US exposure in many places.
What a fabulous conversation. And I saw what you did there. You shed light on how the greatest use of silver is in solar panels to create energy. Very good. Well done, Benoit. I want to thank you for joining the podcast today. This has been a great conversation, and I'm already looking forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Many thanks, Rajan.
The
content of this podcast, including facts, views, opinions, and recommendations, is not to be used or construed as investment advice and is not an offer or an invitation to buy or sell any security. The content of this podcast should not be relied upon for any purposes, and Mackenzie Financial Corporation is not responsible for any reliance upon it. This podcast includes forward-looking information that reflects our current expectations or forecasts of future events. Forward-looking information is subject to risks, uncertainties, and assumptions that could cause actual results to differ materially from those expressed herein. Our views are subject to change based on market conditions. Commissions, trailing commissions, management fees, and expenses may all be associated with mutual fund investments and exchange-traded funds. Please read the fund facts and prospectus before investing. The indicated rates of return are historical annual compounded total returns, including changes to unit values and reinvestment of all dividends or distributions, and does not take into account sales, redemptions, distribution, or optional charges or income taxes payable by any security holder that would have reduced returns.